Okay.
And I'm going to talk about it. What is this, a volunteer?
This volunteer.
Israel. You like a volunteer? No, I want to.
Do that. So there's a problem that both Marion and I have came to independently, and we see it together. And that problem is stated as follows: that as the cause of Israel has demanded more and more support and gathered more support from the American Jews have organized to hi guys. Please do this. Just starting. As American Jews have organized to support Israel's populations and political stance in the United States, the very acts which serve Israel's short, let's say, medium-term interests politically, at the same time cause difficulties for establishing a complex relationship with Israel and part of it. Looks like we're going to have to. It's okay.
We only have 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
I'm dragging you out.
We have to get home done. Israel Advocacy versus Education. So the same impulse that serves Israel's political interests probably works against Israel's long-term, educational interest. And I'll try to tell you. But we know two big things have changed since I was born. Since I was active as the Zionist leader at Columbia University in the late 60s, which I was. Essentially, I'd make Aliyah, and we have a house in Yerushalayim. You know who you're talking about. One thing is that there's far less support for Israel, much involvement with Israel today than there was then, and far less among younger people than older people. I did a study on Israel engagement called Beyond Distancing with my colleague and friend Ari Kelman, which shows that however you measure Israel involvement, talk about Israel, care about Israel, think about Israel, whatever you want to say, younger people are less involved than older people. That's number one. So one is a quantitative decline in the relationship of Jews with Israel over time, and it just goes. It's not just these young kids, these 20-year-olds today. We're talking about a slide that goes from age 85 down to 20 and 25. Number one. Number two, not only is there a decline in the quantitative attachment to Israel, there's also, I believe, a narrowing, a diminution of the qualitative relationship with Israel. I was trained in Zionism as a Zionist before I was trained by Arthur Ritzberg. In 1970, I took a year's class with him. You'll get the notes from the other students. Yeah. And so I'll just go. Let's do it. And the premise of Zionism is that there's a thing called the Jewish people. The Jewish people have a need and a right to express its sovereignty in the land of Israel, and that once Israel is founded, there will be there's different forms of Zionism, but most of them spoke about Jews all over the world maintaining a relationship with the state of Israel, no matter what happens, whether they make Aliyah or not. So in the late 60s, in the early 70s, when I was the Zionist leader at Columbia University, I was being paid by a branch of the Israeli government called the Jewish Agency, in essence, and the Youth and National Youth Department to be the campus representative. And I was being paid to represent the state of Israel, to represent Zionism, to be a Zionist educator. In the course of what I was doing, as well as like most of my friends from different campuses, whose names you will recognize today, were still active in Jewish life, we were supporting a Palestinian state. At a time when the Israeli government was saying that Israelis would commit a crime by speaking with Palestinians. So we were pro-Israel and for a two-state solution to the Palestinian state, and we recognize Palestinian nationalism because to liberate the Jews, you have to liberate the Palestinians, and all that. Right? I just bring that to show you the enormous kind of complexity that was possible in that, for me, was a golden era of American Zionism. Fast forward 40 years. 40 years. I mean, you know. Fast forward 40 years. This is 2008. I'm not thinking about 68, 69, 70. 40 years now. And you have very, very few, I believe, strongly committed American Zionists who are pushing all kinds of positions which are contrary to the official positions of the Israeli government. And I believe that is, I'm not sure if it's bad for the attachment to Israel. I don't really care about that. But I know it's bad from a kind of, let's call it, aesthetic or ideological point of view, in that you no longer have the arguments within American Jewry about what Israel should be doing. And in the 70s, in the 80s, we had these arguments. Settlements, no settlements, sign a peace treaty, no sign a peace treaty, leave it go on, don't leave it go on, bomb Iraq, the nuclear reactor. But all these arguments, those arguments clamped down. And now we no longer talk about Israel. And remember I told you before about these young people coming out in Jewish life? Young people today, when they're active in Jewish life, and they're very attached to Israel on a certain level, Israel, I believe, and Marion, I think, I know it bears me out because we had the same observation. Israel plays kind of a side role. It's like there's everything else. There's text, and there's God, and there's Tefillah, and there's social justice, and there's films, and there's intermarriage, and internet, and there's Israel over there. It's not part of the war for what it used to be Jewish. For me, Israel was Kishkish. Yeah, it was like everything, and there's other stuff too.
Is that part of the motivation of like a Bronfman with birthright to flip that, to bring Israel back into the focus?
That is not part of the motivation of birthright. Part of the major motivation of birthright is to it depends on who's.
It's not for the text. It's for the experience.
It's birthright. I think the motivation. I think it's well placed is to strengthen social relationships among Jews by using Israel as an instrument to waken people up to Judaism and to create Jewish friendships. The Zionist message, I believe, it may be helped, but it's not central to the birthright experience. By the way, I'm not being critical of that. I think it's probably right, but that's not exactly it.
I would add to that the people who started Birthright Israel, who are all a certain vintage, which is just slightly older than us, still saw, as we did at a younger age, that you essentially taught Israel to be educated. What's happened with people younger than us, which we know, is that we become Muslims. We feel we can do our own Jewish education just fine, thank you very much, and the Israel experience is not necessary as part of that education. You don't get educated over there. So some of this education, I think, was part of the motivation to them, who were still thinking in the way that they did. Also, my Steinhardt really believes when you throw young Jews together for 10 days on a bus, you're going to make some Jewish.
Most of my kids are there right now.
Right. So, and it's right.
Okay. Hey, your kids have been Israel. Your kids would have been seriously committed anyway. What do you know Israel for us?
Don't you know they are at risk?
All right. So anyway, so the major thesis is that Israel advocacy and Israel education these days are in some tension, and that if we demand that Jews support Israel's positions and we have a political agenda, we are undermining the educational agenda. In the long run, Israel will suffer. We need to create more space for Jews to be critical and engage with Israel and open up to the moral and political complexities of what it means to be Israeli and pro-Zionist and all those things. That is, I mean, I can't do it full justice, but that's leaping ahead to my position. Gary?
Yeah, if I may, just a brief. Years ago, I was an HCC student and was my third rabbinic year, was one of only 8 students who opted for the year in Jerusalem, the third rabbinic year. Only 8, and that was right after the Yom Kippur War, not Yom Kippur, the 6-Day War. And from the first week that I was there, I noticed the difference in experience of living in Israel as a rabbinical student made. I had seen people who spent their educational careers